Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me here. I did not give him this bibliographical information, so don't blame me. I feel very honored, but also humbled to be here when I see the program with all these distinguished speakers. And especially after yesterday, it's only the second day of this conference, and I already wonder whether what I want to say will bring anything new. To me, it seems that a lot of it has already been said. Maybe it's a matter of great minds think alike, but I leave the answer to that question to your judgment at the end of this lecture. But anyway. Okay. Sometimes, especially when confronted with the huge challenges we face today in terms of poverty, inequality, migration, ecology, I wish I was a utilitarian. For very complex issues appear suddenly to be very simple. As long as one just weighs the consequences of one's actions against each other. You want to know what you should do? Just look at the consequences and opt for the one which implies the most good for as much people as possible. For in this approach, the morally right action is the one that produces the most good. We have to maximize the good. And as Jeremy Bentham, one of the founding fathers of utilitarianism, stated, we have to bring about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number. It is one of the most powerful and still influential normative theories in ethics, up till today. And it is indeed very attractive, also at a policy level, because it seems rather easy. Before making a decision, just consider all consequences, both positive and negative, weigh them off against each other and make your balance. Someone suggests to build a huge shopping mall near Brussels, for instance. Let us consider all the consequences, such as the economic impact in terms of employment and economic growth for the mall versus the cost for local shopkeepers. The impact of the additional mobility this brings around the country's center, which is hardly ever free from traffic jams already, now without the mall. But also the ecological costs of all this extra traffic and loss for environment. So it seems very attractive, isn't it? Fair and simple. Following this approach, the young British philosopher William MacAskill questions in his book, Doing Good Better, how we can make our world a better place. And we is to be taken literally here. Because he starts with provocative thought that we are the 1%, the top 1% of income earners in wealthy nations. Do you earn more than 46,000 euros a year? Then you are part of this 1% world population. Do you earn 24,000 euro a year, 24,000 euro a year, which is about the minimum income level, I think, you're in the richest 5% population of the world. Then you find yourself in a very privileged position compared to other people in our world. And as he states, it provides us with a tremendous opportunity to make a difference. In your country, you might feel poor and might think that the distribution of money, goods, and opportunities could be much more equalized. But overall, taken from the world at large, you and I are in a very good position. We have the power to help others, as he states. And we have an obligation to do so. We have an obligation to consider how we can help others and how we can do so effectively. MacAskill founded this movement, the effective altruism movement. From this utilitarian perspective, it is fairly easy to calculate whether your actions are effective or not. You only have to take these 5 questions into account. How many people benefit, and by how much? Is this the most effective thing you can do? Is this area neglected? What would happen otherwise if you're not doing anything at all? And what are the chances of success? And how good would success be? The result is a provocative, even inspirational book on how seemingly ordinary and private choices can make the most difference for a lot of people. Take, for instance, the choice of a career. He elaborates on a young man who wants to become a medicine. As a real utilitarian, he calculates how many people he would help, how many lives he would save over a 40 years career, considering how many other medicines there are in the local neighborhood already, etc. Maybe, he wonders, I have to go to Africa, where I could be of greater help, no doubt. Sure, but in fact, the guy concludes from this perspective, in terms of what would really make a difference, it would be better that if he becomes a businessman who makes a lot of profit, that he then can share with charities or research that really make a difference for world poverty and healthcare, etc. And it's summarized in what McEskill called the earn to give principle. Rather than trying to maximize the good you do directly via your job, you instead try to increase your earnings so you can donate more, give more, and help people in that way. This makes me wonder whether opting for becoming a theologian is the best way to serve humankind. But before you all start to make similar reflections and maybe end up in an identity crisis, or even worse, a latent burnout, I can console you. McEskill also applies this to other choices we make, day in, day out, such as volunteering. Where do we spend our free time on? Or supporting charities. He makes a controversial statement that you should not give to disaster relief, although you will have an emotional inclination to give when there is an earthquake, for instance. But you should not, because a lot of other people, so many other people, will do exactly the same as you would. And thus your specific contribution will not be as worthwhile as when you spend it to another issue which is not giving so much attention. Comfort question 3, what is a neglected cause? And the same thought, and here I come to the consuming society, finally, the same thought applies when you think about our choices we make as consumers. Again, controversially, he states, you should not stop buying clothes made in sweatshops. For as long we have not figured out a more just economy, sweatshops are a better place to be in than on the streets, unemployed, without any earning at all, he claims. For what would happen otherwise if there were no sweatshops is the right question to ask here, he wonders. What about fair trade? In his book, McEskill points out that the poorest countries cannot afford fair trade certifications. Only a small amount of the additional money spent ends up with the farmers. At worst, they stay with a middleman. At best, it goes to the fair trade organizations, but still not to the farmers themselves. Hence his plea to buy cheaper products instead of expensive fair trade goods and spend the money again to charities that would really make a difference. And almost the same goes for locally produced goods. Why would tomatoes grown in the Netherlands be better than the ones in Spain if the emissions are much higher because of heating and lighting in greenhouses here in the Netherlands than the emissions of the transportation by bringing them from Spain to here? Locally grown is not always ecologically better. So again, buy cheaper products and give the money to charities. Hence, I hope you can see why I regret not being a utilitarian. For things seem so fairly simple. And it is a very intriguing thought experiment, isn't it? But of course there's a but, and I still have some time, so of course there's a but. And I want to make two critical remarks. There are a lot of things you can say about this approach, but I will focus on two. One has to do with power, another one has to do with the anthropology behind it and its view on poverty and equality. First, power. This utilitarianism takes, in a very simple way, the status quo as its starting point. We are able to help others and should do that through the choices we make also as consumers. But the question why this we has this privileged position in the first place is not asked. How come that we have the luxury to reflect on questions such as inequality, ecology, and migration? That we can make choices as consumers? That we happen to be in the front of the seat so that we can decide how much to whom we give money and aid, whether or not we let the migrants in or close our borders, or whether or not we approve or reject measures to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and thus determining the fate of thousands, even millions of people. McEskill does not ask these questions. He takes the situation as it is for granted. Hence, he does not question why the we has the power to make these decisions. And through these decisions, we gain even more power. For as Sir Anthony Atkinson, in his book Inequality, he's the British economist and mentor to Thomas Piketty, makes the following comparison. By just giving one coin, one does not really exercise power. But Bill Gates shows with the Gates Foundation that charities can have a huge impact on the life of others. And this impact may be very advantageous to people, it still remains a kind of influence through power. Hence, such a utilitarian approach indirectly accepts the fact that we have power over the life of others due to inequalities in wealth without questioning these inequalities. And this applies not only to the utilitarian approach, but to any theory which focuses on the power that consumers have in the market economy. As consumers, we have the opportunity to vote with our feet, as the Dutch journalist Kool Hagens phrased it in his book, The Biggest Show on Earth on the Myth of the Market Economy. It's in Dutch, but this is the translation of the title. Neoliberals, he points out, such as Milton Friedman, make us believe that the greatest power we can get is through our consumer behavior. By choosing for this shampoo or that one, for fair trade or cheaper food, for organic or other vegetables, for this supermarket or another one, we show which values we consider as important and thus change the world. Where we go as consumers shows what we believe is important, valuable, and thus the choice we make as consumers helps us to organize society. For if we refuse to buy this product, it won't be produced anymore, either because governments forbid it, or because, by changing the law, or because the producers themselves go bankrupt, and thus we change society. We vote with our feet. Consuming is the new voting. Even better than politics, the famous economist Friedman claims. But it is a false feeling of power, Hagens replies. First of all, because the power is exercised through money, so that $1 is one vote. Thus the wealthy elite has more votes, has more influence, and so that their privileged lives remains completely untouchable, unquestioned, because they can hold their power. As consumers, we do have power, but we can only use it to tackle the symptoms, instead of questioning the causes. Yes, we can buy fair trade, but are in no position to ask why not the whole economy is fair to begin with. And should not the goal in the long term be that these choices as conscious consumers would not be needed anymore? This brings me to the second point. What power do we really have? And more importantly, about what? Yes, we can choose what we consume and buy and which shops we go to. And let us agree for a moment we would have perfect information on where our goods come from and what the consequences are, so that we could really make very conscious decisions in our consumption behavior. What are we really deciding on? Indeed, it is important to be aware of the impact of our consumption has. In a globalized world, every single act is significant, and we can make a difference as consumers in the way we consume. But are we not misled in believing we have power and participate in the development of our society and world, whereas the really important decisions, the framework within which we can make these decisions, is being developed above our heads. What kind of nation do we want? What kind of Europe do we envision? What kind of world are we striving for? How should our money be spent globally, nationally? These are questions that we have no power to decide on. And this is important, this difference in power. As, again, Koen states, and you see the quote, participation in politics is fundamentally different than participation in the economy. The first feeds citizenship and community building. The second promotes individualism. This brings me to the second fundamental problem of utilitarianism and a focus on the power of consumers through the choices they make, its anthropology and its subsequent interpretation of poverty and inequality. Both McEskill and neoliberals typically take the individualistic anthropology as its starting point, which has already been mentioned a few times here. Human beings are autonomous, atomistic individuals like atoms who can make choices freely to organize their lives and the world. We are faced with huge inequality and poverty, as well as ecological challenges, etc., and we can choose to what extent we want to contribute to its solutions. Often, the other is seen as an intruder to one's personal sphere, a burden that one has to live with and deal with. At the best, one feels responsible, and thus one wonders about what we need to do for each other in an altruistic way, as McEskill would claim. A different anthropology, a relational one, takes the opposite starting point. We are already first connected and in relationship with others, from which we then discover ourselves as individuals, as unique persons. These differences, this change in order, starting from the person or from the relationship, is to me more than merely terminology and abstract thinking, as it is shown by the subsequent interpretation of poverty and inequality. According to the first perspective, poverty is most of the time reduced to a lack of material goods, limiting their capacity for self-development. Hence, we want to help, not an innocent choice of words, by the way, we want to help them to achieve those goods so that they can build up their life as they want. The second perspective, on the contrary, considers poverty as a relational problem. Poverty points to the breakdown of society. It signifies the fact that our social relationships have gone completely wrong. Atkinson, whom I mentioned before, even takes it a step further and criticizes inequality exactly for this reason. If all people lack, for instance, certain basic goods, that is less a problem than if some have money to pay for a trip to Mars, while others even don't have money to buy food. Hence, not only poverty, but also inequality is a relational problem. Because, he states, inequality threatens social cohesion. Put differently, the real problem of poverty is not so much that people lack certain goods, but rather the exclusion and marginalization it generates. It puts people literally in the margin, as if they don't matter, as if they are something not to be concerned about. And what to think of society or an economy that does not only exclude people, but which also gives affluent people the opportunity to opt out voluntarily, to exclude themselves voluntarily. For instance, people who are wealthy enough not to have to make use of public arrangements because they can afford private healthcare, private schools in very unequal societies. As the philosopher Brian Barry stated, quote, if the wealthiest fraction of society feels that they can afford to insulate themselves from the common fate and buy their way out of the common institutions, that is also a form of social isolation, unquote. In Evangelium Gaudium, Pope Francis stated very clearly that the economy fails, even kills, as it excludes. This idea is not new. Already in the Old or First Testament, God expects from the Jewish people to take special care of the most wicked, most weakest people in their society, the marginalized. Even more so, the loyalty of the Jews to God and God's covenant is judged by how they treat the Anawim, the marginalized. The criterion for the people's loyalty is the common good, expressed by the care for the inclusion of the marginalized, so that they can become real members of society. In recent years, Catholic social thought has translated this idea in justice as participation. We have to include the outsiders in such a way that they can participate in society. And this does not always require full equality, as this picture shows. And actually, I want to go a step further. They should not only be able to watch the game, they should be able to play the game. But I also believe there is more. It is not enough to stop consider people as a burden that we have to take care of. It is not enough to enable them to participate and watch the game or even play the game. We should strive that they can, become the players of the game, based on the conviction that the excluded and marginalized have something to contribute to society, to the common good, that our world would be a better place if they can contribute. Take, for instance, this picture. You see a lovely, black, smiling girl. But this is the full picture. And it turns our stereotypes completely upside down. We would assume a black girl who gets a pencil. Here, she gives the pencil. She has something to give. Hence the question, how do we create this real reciprocity? And what kind of relationships does this ask for? By now, you've probably noticed how I've shifted from a very concrete discourse to a more abstract one. If I only were a utilitarian, I could give you concrete advice on whether to buy local food or fair trade food or whatever. But I'm not a utilitarian, nor an economist. But what I've tried to do here is to point out two things that I believe are important when thinking about our economy and about our consumption behavior. We have to ask the question, does it promote participation of the excluded? And secondly, does it promote reciprocity and thus relationality, also at a global scale? And I come to my conclusion, and as long as we will still ask these questions, as long as we still care enough to raise these issues, the challenges are huge, but there is hope. The biggest challenge of all is, I believe, and it has already been mentioned by Johan as well, what Pope Francis has called the globalization of indifference. And we are not merely to blame for that indifference. It's not merely our fault that we become indifferent. The economy does its part. For it creates what the American theologian Vincent Miller has called an architecture of indifference. We are to blame, however, if we stop fighting this indifference. Do we still fight the indifference? Do we still want to fight it? And if so, how do we fight against it? This indifference is fostered, and that was already mentioned yesterday as well, by anonymity, by anonymous structures, systems, and institutions. This anonymity functions as a relief. We don't know the people, which are only abstract numbers in terms of unemployment rates, poverty statistics, or refugee numbers. And thus, we don't have to care about them. It's only a small step from anonymity to indifferent, to lose the connection with the particular person, with the each, when being confronted with the anonymous them. As the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur stated, how do we keep on seeing le chacun, the each, through the anonymous on? I believe it is possible to fight this indifference and anonymity through an ethics of care and engagement. But such an engagement assumes vulnerability. If we are engaged and committed, if we allow ourselves to be touched by the other, we can get wounded. So either we keep each other at a distance through institutions and anonymous structures, through the one click which ensures me that my goods will be delivered at my doorstep without having to question what it takes from other people to make that happen. We are Amazon. A world in which our lives hardly connect personally, only our interests connect. Or do we envision a society where we see each other's faces, even through the structures, and we allow ourselves to be touched by each other's needs and situations, risking that we get wounded? But as the Italian economist Luigino Bruni describes in his magnificent book, The Wound and the Blessing, we cannot give in to the fear of injury and avoid the embrace, though risking even mortal injury, because from that open wound, caused by the other, and which we cause the other, flows the only blessing that makes human life worth living. The blessing of living together, building a life together, building a society and a world together, does not exist without the wound. To be willing to take that risk of getting wounded will be the difference between building walls or bridges. Thank you very much.